Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today on the California Existing Building Code. As everyone gets settled for today's session, a few reminders before we get started. Please note today's session is being recorded. Please use the Q&A section for any questions today for our speaker, and remember to be constructive in any of those questions or comments to the presenter and to one another to ensure we have a session that is productive. AIA California will submit 2 AIA HSW learning units for those who complete today's session live. And as always, the webinar content and additional resources will be available online shortly after the session today. I will now hand it over to our speaker for today, Michael Malinowski, FAIA. Thank you so much for being here, Michael.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone, and thanks for carving time out of your day for this presentation today. We're actually going to talk about more than the existing building code, but first of all, for those of you who don't know me, I am an architect with a long experience in private practice, but I'm here today in my role as a consultant to AIA California on code and regulatory matters, and have been kind of a code tilted architect for my entire career. Not that I focus just on code, but I've always gotten into the code, and it's kind of exciting to be part of the code development process in the state of California. Sarah mentioned this program will qualify for HSW, and what we're going to do is just talk about buildings and how intersect the use of existing buildings with code, including some case studies, examples, and I am going to put a particular focus on a brand new approach to the code. The tools I use to gather the information, besides my personal experience, is actually referencing documents such as the CEBC documents. There's 2 related to the existing building code, the code and commentary, and then something called Existing Building Code Essentials. And then there are other publications out there like this one you see on your screen from the National Institute of Building Sciences. But my 2 favorite code books, to be really honest, one is by our own Steve Winkle, illustrated by a great illustrator, Francis Ching, who is also an architect, and this book by Ron Guerin, which looks at the code from a whole different lens. It's really, the code is organized, as you all know, that work with the code by topic, and Ron takes a different view and organizes code issues by the sequence that an architect uses in the creation of design for a building. So it's quite a unique book. But before I get into the details of the code, I thought this is where a really important conversation starts, the why. And here it's why existing buildings? Why all this attention on existing buildings? Well, they're all around us, obviously, and they do need work. They need upgraded energy performance. They often need better appearance and character. And they need to actually serve us for our needs today. We are tearing down a lot of buildings in the United States, 1 billion square feet a year. Oh my gosh. And we have millions of buildings sitting empty. Meanwhile, the practice of architecture is actually shifted, and we have recently, based on AIA surveys, now crossed the threshold where architects do more renovation work than work on existing buildings. And when you look at climate action and our goals and the dates that we're trying to reach some reduction in greenhouse gases that will be significant in preserving our climate as a place for humans to occupy this planet. The building area that exists today mostly will still exist in 2050. So we have an awful lot of buildings that are unavoidable. Many of you have heard a phrase that Carl Elefante, former AIA president, is widely credited with coming up with, that the greenest building is the one that already exists. Well, this study is actually a study that I have found very influential in my own thinking about existing buildings, because this study authoritatively documented that when you create even a high performing new building, it can take up to 80 years before the energy and carbon reduction benefits of that new building overtake the deficits created during demolition and construction itself. And what that means when you look at what's happening in terms of our climate and the urgency for action, this chart here really shows dramatically how things, and this even more so because this is just from a few weeks ago in our own area, California, where on 22nd of July, we broke the hottest day on the planet. And one day before, that was a record-breaking hottest day on the planet. So we're in a situation where there's a crisis and new buildings cannot get us out of this crisis. It's really not possible because we have so many existing buildings. When we tear them down, the embodied carbon emissions from tearing down buildings cannot be recovered for decades. So at the same time we have this climate crisis unfolding, we have other crises in California and across the country. We have billion square feet of vacant office space in the United States, and the value of that buildings is declining. Meantime, at the same time, we have this housing shortage of millions of units. There's different people coming up with different numbers, but it is millions and millions of needed housing units. And you look at those two things together and they kind of intersect of, hey, can't we take some of these underused and empty commercial buildings and make residential uses out of them? And while those conversations are going on, in the meantime, those of you who are members of AIA know that the whole perspective on our codes has shifted. This Blue Ribbon report that came out in 2019 realized that we have to elevate our thinking about codes as not just preventing buildings from burning and from falling down. We have to consider how they affect the human condition and how they affect the environment. And that new version and vision for codes has been very influential in AIA California, where we have actually brought forward the very first embodied carbon mandatory measures in the United States. And they're actually in effect right now. They went into effect in July this year. This was a huge 4-year effort, just like the changes to the existing building code. And I was proud to play a role in making both of these major code changes. And if you looked at the details of how these embodied carbon reduction measures apply, there is a big emphasis on reusing our existing buildings. So let's take this kind of soup, this mix of issues, all of which are occurring at the same time, and try and pull some multidimensional solutions together, because given the number of issues we face as a state, we do have to look at it multidimensional. Oh, and one additional thing we want to avoid, something that maybe some of you have heard of, the urban doom loop. That's where you have urban spaces where there are fewer people there during the day. That's true in every city in America today. So you have lower tax revenues, which mean that city services drop, which means that crime and safety and health all deteriorate, which results in fewer people wanting to be in our urban centers. And that creates this sort of spiral, kind of like a death spiral, really. So you look at the numbers of buildings and the opportunities just in our state. The Rand Corp did a study, an authoritative study, that shows that there are 100,000 housing units just in the city of LA that can be created from commercial properties. And a HDR Calthorpe study showed that our commercial strips, like they looked at El Camino Real, there are literally hundreds of thousands of dwelling units that can be created by rethinking how we utilize that. So we as architects, we have a certain turf we work in. Creativity, that's our turf. Codes, that's the turf of architects. There is a third constraint affecting these kinds of projects, cost, and that's not totally the turf of architects. We play a role in that, but that's a bit more complicated. But much of this is the area where architects center their practice and their service to society, as well as running a business that's sustainable. So now let's look at codes for existing buildings. There are actually a number of codes that can be used when working on an existing building, codes that you're all familiar with. California Building Code, California Residential Code, California Historic Code. Not everybody works with that all the time. And maybe even less known is the California Existing Building Code. And of course, as architects, we have a lot of other codes that we have to deal with as well on every project. Cal Green, the fire code, energy code, the mechanical, electrical, plumbing codes, and a brand new code. I don't know if those of you who are tracking the code development process and this intervening code cycle that is underway right now, nearing its conclusion, there is a whole new code book coming out. California Title 24, Part 7, effective January 2027, the California WUI code. And this is actually a major advance because it's bringing together all the different wildland urban interface requirements that were scattered over codes and regulations and other sections of our legal and regulatory landscape. It brings them all together in one place and also includes some optional best practice information in one book. So let's look at the options for a real project. So I assume many on this call are architects and you've got real buildings that you're working on. So what are your choices? And you know, many of you may know these already, but I'm going to cover the full landscape. You have the California Building Code and the California Residential Code for certain kinds of projects, 1 to 2 dwelling units, townhouses, live, work, lodging. You have the Historic Building Code, which works in conjunction with the CEBC. You have the California Existing Building Code. That one code has 3 different compliance paths that you can choose from, 2 of which have been in place since that code came out. And many of you know that the California Existing Building Code used to be in the California Building Code as Chapter 34. It split off a number of years ago to be a separate freestanding code. 2 of those methods have been in the California Existing Building Code from the beginning. Another one is brand new. That's the work area method. And we're going to talk about all these different approaches here today. Some of them a little bit and some of them in more depth. Now you notice on the bottom of my little chart here, I say plus AMMR. And AMMRs exist as a potential in all of the California codes. Well, some may not know, what do I mean when I say AMMR? AMMR is an alternate materials and methods request. It's like a performance code provision in these codes, which are essentially prescriptive codes. And AMR, in terms of its structure, has 3 parts. First is, what does the code say you're supposed to do? Second is, what is the intent of that provision? And third is, how does your proposed design accomplish that intent, even though it may not meet the letter of the code itself? For those of you who want more background, and all these links are going to be available as a separate document that's going to be shared with attendees or made available as a link that you can follow up, and Sarah may have us that she can post it in the chat. But don't worry about copying down these links. This is a white paper that I helped write about using the AMMR process. Now, I mentioned the existing building code. When you look at the existing building code at the national level, there's a whole chapter that's a performance code chapter in the IEBC, and it creates an entirely different code compliance path. Now, here in California, that chapter has not been published or adopted until July of this year. And as part of our major progress in the intervening cycle, thanks to the hard work of the State Fire Marshal and a lot of volunteers and different agencies, this is now published in California, but not adopted. It is available for adoption in local jurisdictions. I know of one that's potentially thinking about it, but it's a pretty complicated chapter. But those of you who know the material, because it used to be in California codes, published and not adopted in Chapter 34, this is unique. It's unique code because it's based on a point system. So it tries to bring a objective foundation to how you evaluate life safety. So you analyze a building using Chapter 13, and for deficiencies, you assign negative points, and then you get positive points to balance the negative by life safety enhancements. And you have to meet a score that's in a table over 23 measures. By the way, in my slide deck, when you see this little bullseye, that's kind of what I think is a special point. So this code chapter is not adopted, but it is a valuable tool for creating AMMRs. And I myself have used it that way on a number of complex projects. This is a little table that tells you what the scores that you need to meet are. In the point system in Chapter 13, it really only covers 3 categories: fire safety, egress, and general safety. So the rest of the kinds of issues that you have to deal with in a building are covered by other codes or other parts of the existing building code. And again, we don't have this available yet in California, but it is available for local adoption, and it's certainly available for reference. Now, some of you may be a little like me and look at a table like this and think, here's some cool numbers here, because these numbers as mandatory minimum safety scores ideally would represent the relative safety demands of different occupancies. I looked at these numbers and they didn't make sense to me. So I've inquired at the ICC and was informed that I would have to talk to the people who are on the committee that developed this table. And that was done so long ago that it's been in place for decades. And so far I haven't gotten any explanation. And the way points are, the negative points are assigned and the positive points are assigned, there's a lot of variables in there based on the occupancy. So what I'm warning you is, do not assume or do not argue to your code official that because the B occupancy for means of egress has 40 points required, that it means that it has a higher requirement than R occupancy, which has 38. You can't use it that way, unfortunately. It would be great if you could, but you can't. Let's now go back to that table I put on earlier, and I said there were 5 compliance paths, just so that they're easier to keep straight in your head. I've given each one a name. So number 1 is the regular code, the California Building Code. And I honestly think that is rarely the best option, but it does have a place, and it can be easier to interpret. It's certainly the best known of the codes that we work with as architects, or the residential code, if your scale of your project allows that to be used. So that's out there, and you can use it. We're going to talk about that for just a couple of minutes, but not put a lot of attention on that. The California Historic Building Code, I've used that code on quite a few projects, and I've used the other codes, and my personal opinion is that code is almost always the best option if your building qualifies for its use. It is a short code. You can sit down and read it in an hour and a half. It's easy to use, and it has some utterly amazing provisions. If they're usually not familiar with it, I'm going to go through this code and show you some of the magic, honest to gosh magic, that is in the California Historic Building Code. And frankly, it's going to get better because that code development committee has just been rebooted, and I believe it's going to even improve more and be more effective. Then you have the California Existing Building Code. Now you see that listed in 3 columns. That's because that code, again, unique among codes, it gives you a choice. I have to tell you the story. When we were in the process of getting the work area method brought to California, which was a 4-year effort, because it involves 6 chapters. How do you bring 6 chapters all in one fell swoop to a code through the typical code development process? Not an easy lift. And unfortunately, they all had to be brought in at the same time because it requires all 6 of those chapters to be functional. Well, I can tell you that one of the concerns that was raised to me along the way was from an architect said, Mike, why are you going to add another code book to my shelf here just makes it more complicated for us. And I told them, you're misunderstanding. These are choices. And guess who gets to make the choice of which of these compliance paths, 3, 4, 5, you're going to use on a particular project? You, the architect, chooses, not the building official, not the building owner. The architect chooses. And if you choose number 3, then you're not worrying about 4 or 5. If you choose number 5, then you're not worrying about 3 or 4. Although the way the chapters are written, there are chapters that apply no matter what you do. Chapter 3 always applies to any use of the California existing building code. But the way that book is structured, you cannot pick it up, open a chapter, and assume that chapter is going to have value or relevance to your project. It may not have any application to your project at all. You cannot know until you go through the scoping process. So this is a scoping code, kind of like the accessibility codes in California. First, you have to define the nature of the project, and then you have to make your choice about the horse you're going to ride to get to the finish line. Then you have the information to determine what in that book is applicable to your project. There are 3 approaches as of July that are available for design professionals in California to use on existing buildings. And there's some caveats. I'm going to talk about all 3 of these. But first, let me start at the beginning, the California Building Code. I just want to make sure you know that it says you can use this code for replacement, repair, enlargement, alteration of existing building codes. If you're taking a project that literally involves an existing building that you are totally gutting, let's say you're taking the skin off, you're gutting the contents, you're just left with the structural framework, well, you might as well use the California Building Code because everything in that building is literally going to be new and the structure is readily accessible. So other than there may be structural issues that you cannot resolve easily, but there are times when there's not going to be a huge difference, but it's pretty rare, I think, that code is going to be. Now, I've mentioned the California Residential Code. You know that it, and its language also says that it can be used for alterations. Usually that code only allows use for 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses, not more than 3 stories in height. But California Building Code says, and the live work units can use the California Residential Code. And I can tell you one major jurisdiction, the city of LA, is really making great use of this live work provision. They have a whole chapter in their municipal code. And for those of you who don't live in LA, hey, sorry, you don't get to use this, but chapter 85 has some really great stuff in it. And it's being revisited now. It's the adaptive reuse ordinance that's under, they're calling it version 2. These live work, the CRC can also be used for owner occupied lodging houses with 5 or fewer guest rooms. Not everybody knows that. There's a definition of live work, and it's, you know, a little vague. Significant portion, what does that mean? Does it mean 50%? Could it be 10%? Does it mean that it has to be measurable? Does it mean to have to be defined? I've seen it interpreted a lot of different ways. But when you look at the things that it allows, it does have some limitations. So in my presentation, when you see the little triangle with the exclamation point, that's either a trigger or a limit, and a particular clause that I think is important. So these limitations, there's a square footage limit, there's a limit of how much of the total area you can use for non-residential use. It has to be on the first or main floor, and you can't have more than 5 people that work in that occupancy. But you know, it allows you to use the CRC, but then it says that you need to classify it as a group R2 occupancy, which normally isn't covered by the residential code. So, but you don't have to put in separations. There are some other things covered by that. And again, in the city of LA, they've really taken this to a very high level. California Fire Code is not necessarily a code that architects spend a lot of time with. It is the only code that really applies to existing buildings. They're Chapter 11, and it'll, the inspections that fire departments do of an existing building, they're looking for things in Chapter 11. The adoption table is important here because this chapter only affects certain kinds of occupancies, R1, R2, A occupancies over 10,000 square feet, high rises, and it has basic requirements similar to what's in the housing law. Let's move now to the California State Historic Building Code. This code is used for qualified historic buildings. Now, what is a qualified historic building? That's a building, and there's a definition in there. That's a subset of all buildings. It is used at the discretion of the owner, and for design professionals, that means it's up to you. In other words, the use of this code has to be opted into by the design professional. So you have to identify its use on your construction documents. You have to make it really clear in your code analysis. This is the code you're referencing. If you opt to use it, the state agencies and the local jurisdiction has to accept it. It is easy to understand and apply. It's written in a conversational style that many will find like, oh, wow, this is a code I can actually sit down and read, which unfortunately means that there can be variations in how it's interpreted by local jurisdictions. And I'm going to tell you, though, that this code has a unique element in it that can overcome this variation in local interpretation. Like in any code, whenever I'm looking at a code, I always check the definitions. And I know many architects know that, yeah, that's something that you learn to do. It's not something you necessarily learn to do in your architecture school, but you learn to do it when you're in practice and you get a surprise and you find out that some phrase or word has a particular definition in the code. And they're identified in the code because they're in italics. Qualified historic building is defined. And one of the things that's commonly misunderstood is the date issue. I've heard people state with authority, self-authority, that 50 years is a magic date. Actually, there is no date specified in the historic code. There are some California references to 50 years as a date, but the National Park Service, which handles the registry, does not cite this date as an absolute rule. And you can find younger buildings on historic registries. And again, because this code is so powerful, sometimes a petition to have a building listed is a very good strategy for an architect to consider. And that isn't always a very long process either. It depends on the local jurisdiction. Other key definitions, one is character defining features. And those are the elements that really make the building rich, gives it its historic special character. Open stairs are common in historic buildings. Open stairs designed in a way that you can't do as an egress element in modern buildings, but they can be beautiful elements that become protected by the State Historic Building Code and allowed to stay in use because of that. Some code officials think that unless a building is character defining or unless an element, that aspect of a building isn't protected, but there is an overall feasibility clause. And again, I'm going to show you how you can resolve differences of opinion using some of the tools that are available in this code. Distinct hazard is another defined term. And those are things that are an immediate danger to the safety of occupants in public right-of-way. Well, architects don't want to be involved in institutionalizing immediate dangers to occupants or public right-of-ways. So this is not a major issue, and it clarifies in the code that just because something doesn't meet regular code, current code, or doesn't meet a local ordinance, that does not itself mean that something is a distinct hazard. And that's an appealable determination as well. And I'm going to show you how that works in just a minute. The CEBC is applicable to all issues regarding code compliance, but what's unique about it is it's not a complete code by itself. It has to be used in conjunction with the regular code, the California Building Code. There is a mandate that it be used by agencies whenever it's the code selected by the design professional, the owner, and the building qualifies. It does allow buildings to be expanded, non-historical expansion or addition, when those conform to the requirements of the regular code. And they also cannot detract from the historic substance of the building. In other words, you can't wreck a building with an addition to make it non-historic, which makes sense. And repairs can be in kind. That can be a little tricky to navigate, as many practicing architects know, because materials might not be available, or they may have changed, like the dimension of a 2x4 has changed over the years significantly. So one made today is not necessarily going to be the same strength as one that was cut in 1930, but these are things that can be overcome. Building use can remain regardless of the time when it's been unoccupied. Some people think there's a rule of thumb that if a building is abandoned and empty for 40 years, then it loses its ability to use, to reestablish the original use. That's not true. That's written right in the code. And changes of occupancy do not mandate conformance with new construction. That's a big one for architects. And that's stated as clearly as I've put it here. Check it out, 8-302.2, a really great tool, especially when you're talking about the kind of project that AIA California is very excited about, which are commercial to housing adaptive reuse. Some of the other cool things in this feature: you're unlimited in floor area. Once you sprinkler a building, most of the required separations get either omitted or can be reduced to 1 hour, and many can be simply omitted due to the fire sprinkler, the active fire protection. You're not limited in terms of construction type to any particular height or number of stories, because if a building was built and it's been that way, it can be, and there's a statement that the CEBC requires enforcing agencies to accept any reasonable equivalent alternative to the regular code. I mean, how great is that? The way structure is dealt with in this code, it allows you to use a lower factor. So you use this 3/4 factor in checking wind and lateral loads, historic. And you can also use this assumed adequacy when you have gravity loads that have been, that you can demonstrate have a complete load path and there's no evidence of distress. So the proof of time has merit in terms of applying the historic code for gravity. Now, those of you who are new to this code, I highly encourage you to go to the Department of General Services, Division of the State Architect resources page. DSA is sort of the custodian of this code, and they manage the code committee that adopts this code and maintains it. Because they have this little click on tool that's to the right here on your screen. It's super valuable, and it talks about fire protection. And you're going to see in there that talking about, for example, partial fire sprinklers. Well, that makes every fire official wince, but they're provided for in this code, particularly for particular tough situations, like you have openings in an area where you're either not permitted or you need protection. So you can have opening protections via an active sprinkler system. And it makes these statements and cites the code provisions. So it's a great place to come to look for tools. But the very best thing about this code is it has authority, unique among California codes, interpretive and appeal authority written right into the law that establishes it. And if you go to that website that I just showed you earlier, you're going to find that there are three, count them, three different approaches to getting a determination. That means if you have a disagreement with your building official, or the building official himself or herself wants to get an opinion, an authoritative opinion, they can use this 3-level appeal process. One is an informal conversation. Yes, you can email or call someone and have them tell you what a code provision means or help you solve a particular issue. You can do a quasi-formal consultation with the subcommittee of the code adopting body that manages this code. And you can also file a formal appeal. These tools are available to design professionals and code officials. And again, unique among codes. So it helps with creating uniformity. Very little utilized, and I think it's because it's just not widely known. So make a particular note of this. This is probably the greatest thing in the California Historic Building Code. Not only the provisions are great, but this magic that these determinations can bring to the table are really outstanding. Okay, we're going to change gears now and talk about a different code. You remember when I said that there were 5 different approaches? We've talked about 2 of them. The other 3 all come from the California existing building code. One of the 3 paths is brand new. It's the work area method, just effective as of a few weeks ago, July of this year. And that's due to an effort, concerted effort that was undertaken on behalf of AIA California. And again, involved a lot of people from all over the state, and a lot of code experts and fire officials and building officials from up and down the state. So very proud of the progress we made in bringing this to the table. The philosophy of the California existing building code now follows the logic that was used to create the international existing building code. And that is to have this progression of code compliance that becomes more strict as a project moves between these different levels. So it goes from repair. There are 3 levels of alteration, which I'll describe. This is a little confusing. Change of use and additions. By the time you get to additions, pretty much, not 100%, but pretty much meet current code. When you're down here at repairs, it's really simple what you need to do. So when you look at it in terms of the table of contents, that's the point when my presentation crashes. So apologies for that. I don't know why it was doing that earlier, but I'm gonna have to go back to where I was, which is a slide right here. Sorry about that. So if you look at the California existing building code from the table of contents standpoint, you find that it has a bunch of chapters in it. Chapter 12, it's not adopted in California. We have a whole separate historic building code. That's what I've been talking about for the last, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes. Chapter 13, I have an orange here because it's printed but not adopted. It is very useful as a reference. You have the prescriptive compliance paths that's been in place in California now since this code became part of our code landscape. That still exists, but now we have this additional work area. Now I drew a yellow line. Every project is going to involve chapters 1, 2, and 3. Anytime you have a project using the California existing building code, you are going to be using chapters 1, 2, and 3. Most projects, no matter which compliance path you use, are going to be using chapter 4. Chapter 5 is only used if you choose the prescriptive compliance path, and chapters 6 through 11 are only applicable if you use the work area compliance path. And which of those chapters is applicable depends on what exactly you're doing in your project. And I know that all sounds pretty confusing, but just bear with me because I'm going to go through this all in greater detail. Some other foundational considerations here, just to get on the table. Number 1, the IEBC and the California existing building code is really not designed to finish building a shell building. It's only for buildings or portions of buildings that have been previously occupied. And that's a high-level interpretation from the ICC. As of July 24th, the State Fire Marshal adopted the work area method. They adopted it only for non-high rise and non-high risk occupancies. That means that there are building types and building projects for which you cannot yet use the work area method. We do intend, AIA California intends to be continuing to work with the State Fire Marshal in future code cycles to increase the tent and expand it, but this is where we are as of today. HCD also did not adopt the work area method in the last code cycle. However, they are moving to adopt it in the current code cycle. That would be effective in January of 2026. Because that adoption process is already well underway, it's already gone through the code committee. It hasn't gone to the building standards, but I'm sure it's going to be approved. Many building officials will allow you to use it for residential uses. There's also a nuance that will help convince a building official that that is okay, and that is because both HCD and SFM have oversight authority over residential occupancies in the law. The other thing I'm noting here, and I have a little triangle with the exclamation point, flood hazard. Flood hazard requirements are the same no matter what compliance approach you use. And when you do substantial improvements, you must meet the flood level elevation for the area. That's consistent across all chapters, and that's in meet current code basically. So be careful if you're in a flood hazard area, and because those standards do not depend on what compliance path you choose. So as I mentioned, all projects are going to use chapters 1, 2, and 3. Most projects are also going to use chapter 4 because most projects involving an existing building have some degree of repair. And you don't have to cite repairs in your code analysis necessarily, although I do think it's helpful to a code official if you make it clear, and you can do that with a narrative scope. And one reason to do that is because, as you'll see as we get into the details here, those provisions are pretty loose, pretty flexible, and pretty workable, pretty easy to understand as well, and pretty easy to apply with a couple of rubs that you might get into that I'll mention, like I did already, dimensional lumber being different, so you may have to show that the lumber you're using has equivalent strength to the lumber that was used historically. So let's talk about chapter 1. That's the basic nuts and bolts that define the scope. So what is this code for? And this isn't a chapter most architects are going to spend much time with. It's about the due practice of law. But like all the codes in California, the adoption tables are part of the code landscape. And I know most architects, many building officials cringe over the adoption tables because it's this alphabet soup of state agencies and different adoptions. And what you find is state agency adoption process can lead to different language for the exact same issue. Now, here's an example from the adopted California existing building code. One adoption by HCD and one adoption by SFM. They're pretty much exactly the same in terms of the outcome. Why do they use different words? I'm not sure. Maybe there's some logic there. Maybe that's just how it played out. It just creates baggage when the same thing is accomplished with different words. It makes code bulkier. Hopefully at some point there is some effort to do some cleanup, but everybody's busy all the time, also in the state agencies. So unless a topic comes up as part of an adoption, just making the code more lean and easy to use isn't usually necessarily a main driver of code change. I like this one. So here's a few things that I think are cool for architects. 104.2.2. It basically tells the code official shall meet with the permit applicant prior to the application for certain kinds of work. This doesn't say may meet or could meet or hopefully will meet. It says they shall meet. It is a mandate. Now, many building officials, they want to meet with you early in the process. And really smart building departments, in my view, offer pre-development meetings at no cost because it saves everyone, including the building department, time and money. But there are not any equivalent requirements that I'm aware of in other codes. And I would encourage architects to take advantage of this. And if you ever get pushback, say, hey, check out 104.2.2. You have to meet with me unless if it's just a repair or level 1 alteration. Those projects, I guess, are considered simple enough. They're beneath the mandate of this clause. Change of occupancy. What is a change of occupancy? Well, I know you all intuitively know what a change of occupancy is. Unfortunately, it's complicated, more complicated than you think. It's more than just changing what letter and numbers assigned to the occupancy by the CEBC. It's more than that. It's about how a building is used, the level of activity, and you may be in the same occupancy classification. So there is a distinction in the California existing building code and in the IEBC for changes of occupancy classification versus change of occupancy, which is a much broader envelope. And I know it's something that takes a little while to get your head around, but it's a real thing, and you need to be aware of it. It isn't always going to come up, but it can come up. Some other terms that seem like they might have intuitive meaning, but they don't. They have very specific meaning. What is an incidental structural change? Well, just remember 5%. 5% is incidental. What's a minor structural change? 10%. 10% is minor. What's a major structural change? Anything that isn't 5 or 10%. If it's 11%, it's major. If it's 22%, it's major. But if you just remember, incidental means 5%, minor means 10%, major. And those, you'll see those numbers popping up in other places in the code, just like the 75% that you already saw in the State Historic Building Code. Here's a couple other definitions that I thought were important. Substantial. There's a difference between major and substantial. Yeah, substantial means the cumulative impact over a 5-year period of alterations that affect the structure's ability to serve intended purpose. And that's 30%. So substantial is 30% over a longer period of time. Some may wonder, what is BS here? And it isn't the pejorative BS. Why are these bracketed terms in here? Those, just for those of you who aren't aware, that's a reference to the code committee at the I-code level that is assigned to this definition, because each part of the code is assigned to a different committee. And sometimes in the same chapter, it's broken up into parts and pieces, and definitions are assigned all over the map. So they're of really little relevance to California unless you're trying to make a code change at the national level. But that's what those mean. Those are not state designations. Risk category is a very important terminology. And this is based on the CEBC section 1604. And there are 4 structural risk categories. This is about structure. Category of in determination of loads from flood, wind, snow, ice, and earthquake based on unacceptable performance. Almost all buildings are risk category 2. If it's ag, minor storage, temporary, it's a lower risk category. And if it's high occupancy assembly use or education or institutional occupancies or schools occupancies or surgery, fire, rescue, police, power plants, toxic plants, aviation control, those are higher risk categories. Those are important to know because that's what often triggers the need for a structural upgrade. And fortunately, chapter 16, most buildings are in category 2. What does technically infeasible mean? And again, I know you all intuitively know what that means, but I'm telling you there's a definition of it, and it's based on structure being in the way of allowing something to happen, or site constraints, like you cannot add a normal second exit because the building is built to the property line on 3 sides, and it's too narrow to meet the requirements for diagonal distance, plus so maybe there's a constraint that allows you to use a fire escape. It's about things that you cannot change reasonably, like load-bearing members that are essential to the structural frame. Another big term is work area. And that's one of the most confusing parts, frankly, of the International Existing Building Code and the California Existing Building Code. So I'm going to spend a little more time on it. But here's the written definition. Reconfigured spaces as indicated on the construction documents. And yes, architects, you do have to show where the work area is on your plans. It's actually a code requirement. It excludes other portions of the building that have incidental work that's triggered, like accessibility, not because of an owner doing something that helps them further their plan for the building, but it's triggered because of some code trigger. And that's the way this is worded. Intended work performed where work was not initially intended by the owner, specifically, and when it's triggered by code. Give you a breath. I'm taking a breath before we get into chapter 3. We're about halfway through. I know it's a long haul. Hang with me for a minute. We'll get through this together. Okay, chapter 3 applies to every single project that uses the CEBC. So if you put on your cover sheet, you are using the CEBC. It doesn't matter which compliance path you choose. You need to look at chapter 3 because it applies to your project. Some of the things in there of note, you cannot mix compliance paths on the same project. So you cannot use the work area for this story and the prescriptive approach for this story. No, it's one or the other because it's a whole package. It's a whole package process. But there is this weird exception, 301.3. Remember I said at the beginning there were 3 compliance paths? This exception is viewed by the ICC and the experts on the existing building code and referenced in all the code materials as a compliance path. What this exception says is alterations can comply with the laws in existence at the time the building was built. If you make alterations conforming to those laws, they comply with the code. If you put in new structural members, they need to comply with current code. But when you replace a structural member or make alterations, you can use the laws in existence at the time the building was built. Now, the opinion, what this also says, though, is it's up to the approval, subject to the approval of the code official. So if you were planning to use this compliance path, number one, you better have good documents of how the building was originally built. And sometimes those plans are available. I find that some building owners are very, very diligent about keeping plans. Others, not so much. You cannot use it for accessibility. You cannot use it to avoid the flood hazard impacts. And you cannot use it for changing the outcome of the structural provisions of Section 304 or the work area or the prescriptive construction. But other provisions, like how the exiting is done, you can use the laws in existence at the time the building was built. All of it, though, it means all the laws, not just cherry picking. So if you have good plans and it makes sense, especially if it's a minor alteration, and again, it's not used very often, but you may have a project where it's like your ticket. It's your ticket to a smooth and simple path forward. You would want to start with a meeting with the building official, say, hey, I'm going to use this exception, and here's how I'm planning to show you that this was compliant with the original construction and these were the requirements. Now there's a HCD note in the adopted California code that points to California Code of Regulations, section 1.8.2.1.1. What is that? Just to save you the hassle, if someone was wondering, what the heck is that? Those are the state housing law regulations, kind of like based on tenement housing and from the 20s and what was needed in order to get living environments more uniform and safer and habitable. Those are the bottom line requirements for sanitation, heating, cold and hot running water, natural light and ventilation, dampness, mold, vermin, garbage. Those citations and those requirements apply. Some of those are actually in the chapter 11 of the fire code too. So those apply to existing buildings, irrespective of whether you're pulling a permit actually. But they're cited in the California existing building code, just to make you aware, and it's not a bad thing to know about. Okay, the prescriptive compliance method. When you're in chapter 3, there's pointers to that, and also a pointer to the work area method. Those just tell you that those are your choice and you can't mix the two. It also tells you that all these other codes potentially are going to apply to your project. The California existing code is not a comprehensive code that covers everything. Of course, neither is the California building code. There's an energy code, there's a fire code, a mechanical code, plumbing code. Anyway, they're all listed here. And sometimes a residential code might apply. You know, again, remember live work. If you have a potential use for live work, and especially if you're in the city of LA, that can be, you can do some pretty amazing things with that. This just clarifies that those parts and pieces form the whole. Existing materials covered in 302.3. You can leave them in place unless they're unsafe. So if you have glass that's not tempered and it's a hazard, the code official can still ask you to replace that, even though it was put in originally. But there are a lot of, most things do not fall into the category of being a hazard. New and replacement materials, you are permitted to use the requirements of new code, and you can use the materials that are the same as what was done originally, provided you don't create an unsafe condition. And you can't use hazardous materials where the new code would not permit their use. And, you know, like safety glazing is one. And I mentioned, you may find that when you're doing a fire repair, that your code plan reviewer says, hey, you can't replace a 2x4 with a 2x4 because these 2x4s from 1920 are not the same as 2x4s from 2024. It's true. So you may have to either make the size larger, you may have to do an analysis to show what an equivalency is. And again, that doesn't always get raised. It can get raised if something looks pretty sketchy. It can also get raised as a matter of course. It's going to depend on the plan review. And I have had that question brought up. Section 304 talks about loads. If your project does not increase the design live load, the existing gravity structural elements can be designed for the live loads that were part of the building's original design. So you can actually go back and see what was permitted and continue to use those loads. If you do increase the live loads, then you have to account for that according to the regular code. This potential to inherit a vintage live load, if you don't change the loading, is important because it can allow you to leave a lot of the structure intact. And when you look at really old buildings, some of the examples I'm going to show later on, like a concrete building built in 1915, the floor was reinforced with like wire mesh that is not unlike anything that you would see in the marketplace today. It was strung like in a shallow parabolic curve. You know, how do you evaluate some of the materials that were used? But again, if it's been carrying the load, it was a storage occupancy. It was the original loading design was for 100 pounds a square foot. So that building can continue to carry 100 pounds square foot as long as the floors are not showing evidence of distress, just like the state historic building code allows you to inherit finished live loads as well. Let's talk about seismic evaluation. Seismic is a big issue in California, especially when there are vintage structural systems. Most buildings more than a few years old. I've had engineers tell me this, and it's been my experience. Most buildings do not fully comply with current code unless they were just built. The code changes regularly. Even steel buildings from the 60s have all kinds of deficiencies under current code because of what was discovered after the Northridge earthquake and how buildings perform. Determinations of what seismic requirements are going to have a big impact on project feasibility. So this is something that has to be looked at early. The requirements are based on two sets of criteria and two different kinds of events. There's a bigger event that's less likely to happen, and then there's a smaller event that's more likely to happen. And each of these have to meet a different level of requirements. So you have this BSC E1E event, and you have a BSE-2E event. This event needs to meet a structural performance of collapse prevention. This event needs to meet a structural performance of life safety, S3. S4 is not used. They skip it here unless you're into risk category 3. That references S4. That's a higher risk category. Most buildings, again, are in risk category 2. You note that risk category 1 and 2 have the same. So even though they're different risk categories, they have the same performance requirements. When you're in working with existing buildings, you get to use that 75% of new load provision that you found in the state historic building code, and that's a big help. I am told by engineers that they have to check both of these, and sometimes one controls and sometimes another, just like with lateral loads, sometimes wind controls, sometimes seismic. So, and the basic idea is you have an event with a 10% probability in 50 years, and you have another event that's 2% probability in 50 years, and they are different magnitude. You also have things triggered like bracing masonry parapets. You have a cantilever, unreinforced masonry wall. Those things have to be upgraded, and many architects and engineers will want to do those things whether or not there's a specific code trigger. Just because they're such high hazard, they affect the public because these elements fall into the street. They're relatively easy to fix. Section 317 requires seismic evaluation and retrofit for state-owned structures. Just a warning, some local building departments have adopted these. The city of Sacramento, where I do some of my work, most of my work, has adopted these to apply to privately owned buildings. This clause is a major deal. It has 5 triggers. There's a construction cost trigger, there's a change in risk category trigger, there's a modification to structural elements trigger, there's a structural item disrepair trigger, and there's a change in design loading trigger. What this means for me, like I was recently working on a potential reuse of a reinforced concrete building built in 1932. Guess what? That building's not going to meet current code. Guess what's going to happen when you are required to do a seismic evaluation and retrofit for that building? Just a seismic evaluation of that building is going to be very expensive. It's going to involve testing of the concrete. It's going to be involved, I mean, it's tens of thousands of dollars, and it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars just to go through the analysis. And then the work that's triggered, and there's almost always, if you do an analysis on a building that age, there is going to be work required. That's going to be, you know, factor 5 to 10 more than the analysis. And it could even be larger than that. So these are deal killers that need to be known about up front. In the project I was working on, this was the first thing I zoomed in on. And I had to check each one of these 5 triggers just to make sure this is a real project, because I knew that the nature of the use was such that it would not survive as a project if it was going to have to go through this, jump through these hoops. Your community may not have adopted this. I hope that at some point the city of Sacramento rethinks its adoption of it, because it's a pretty onerous set of standards. And it is not part of state code, other than for state-owned buildings. Section 317, I point out that here, that if let's say you do the analysis, you find out that the building doesn't conform, which, as I said, is going to be the case for any building that's a decade or more old, probably. And again, I'm not a structural engineer, but that's what I'm told by structural engineers. There's actually 2 outcomes of that for the project. One is fix it. The other one, interestingly, is provide a plan. The plan has to be acceptable to the building official, and the retrofit has to happen in a timely manner. And timely is a term not defined in the code, and that's up to the building official. But that can be really helpful. You may have a project where it lends itself to phasing. Maybe there's some future activity that's going to allow better access to the parts of the building that have to be accessed to perform the upgrade, or maybe it's a temporary use. But anyway, it's 2 things that are defined as appropriate steps. Section 313, some basic requirements for R1 and R2 occupancies, 2 exits when you have a load over 10. You can use a fire escape as one of them. Interior and shaft enclosures that are fire rated. Standard for exterior stair handrails. I've mistyped that. Sorry about that, but you know what I mean. Fire escape as exit ladder devices can be used when it's not feasible to do anything else. Even new fire escapes are possible, but again, depends on the jurisdiction. Doors and openings, if you have an exit corridor and it requires rating, transims are a big issue. Exit signs and occupancy separation or equivalency, which is cited in the code, and that usually means fire sprinklers. That's what they mean by equivalency. Is generally, they don't say it, but that's generally what they'll be looking for. Now let's go to chapter 4. Are you guys all still with me? We're kind of moved into the home stretch here, so hang in there. Chapter 4, and by the way, there's a reduced size version of this that will be available. Of the presentation, I don't think anybody wants to go through the 150 slides or whatever that are this whole deck. So I picked the best decks. So you don't need to write stuff down. You're going to get the key things. Tables and that sort of thing are going to be made available to you. You just have to email the AIA to get a link. Chapter 4, repairs. Basic concept, very simple. Don't make the building worse than it was before the repair. And worse is a broad term, meaning worse structurally, worse in terms of exiting, worse in terms of life safety, worse in terms of toxics. You have to improve or maintain the building when you repair. And you can, repairs, you can go back to the pre-damage condition when the repair is for less than substantial construction structural damage. You just go back to the way it was before. And remember, defined term, right? Remember I flagged that earlier? So if you're in a case like this, where the structure is part of the beauty and the character of the room, that's pretty darn important, right? I'm not going to talk a lot about chapter 5 because that's been in the code, and that is, and actually, one of my friends who's an architect, but far more of a code expert than I am. That's pretty much his thing. That's what he is a in-house code consultant for an architectural firm. He said, Mike, I've gone through the work area method and the performance method. I'm not seeing a lot of difference in the outcome. There is a little bit, but not much. So whatever you've been able to do under the prescriptive method, you'll be able to do that under the work area method. You're going to have more latitude though in terms of how far that work scope is going to extend, in terms of how much of the building you have to touch, and there are some other things that you may not have to do at all. Chapter 5 was adopted, I believe, by California because it's pretty simple. Everything's in one chapter, and they just have sections of that one chapter to talk about things like change of occupancy, windows and emergency escape, fire escapes, alterations. You elect this method. As of July, you probably didn't have to say, I want to use a prescriptive method. It was really the only method other than that one unusual exception method that's rarely used. Most are not even aware that it exists. Now you're going to really have to say, yeah, I'm going to use prescriptive. If you know this and you want to continue using it, it hasn't changed at all. One of the things you'll notice in the prescriptive chapter, that's also in the work area method, is this weird paragraph. You know, when I first saw this, I thought, what the heck is this saying? If you put in a sprinkler system, you can use the current code for fire resistance ratings, but the code official can require you to provide this extensive set of reports and data and investigation to justify using the current code. Why is that chapter, why is this paragraph there? That's because how codes have evolved over the years. You know, it wasn't that long ago that open offices were kind of a novelty, but as changes have occurred in how we use buildings and the geometry of them, the way the code's used has changed. In California, virtually every building is sprinklered now, and there are things that don't have to be fire rated, like hallways, that used to have to be fire rated as corridors. So what this is basically saying is, if you fire sprinkler, some of the things that were allowed by that fire sprinklering maybe were code variations or some other, maybe they were put in for some particular reason that you need to understand before. And anyway, it's rarely used and it's confusing. And I have a feeling that most code officials do not ask for all that detailed analysis. Most fire marshals are so happy to see a fire sprinkler building. They're not going to burden you with a whole bunch of study and analysis and code research and documentation. But just be aware that it's that clause is in there in case it comes up. As I mentioned, those of you who know the work area method, want to continue to use it, go right ahead. Still there, hasn't changed at all. But I'm going to spend now time talking about the work area method because that's brand new. The work area method comprises a bunch of chapters. Chapter 6 is the scoping chapter for the work area method. That chapter tells you what parts of the work area method, which comprises all these chapters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Seventh, we don't use in California because we have a great historic building code. It tells you where to go for the rest of your requirements. If you don't start in chapter 6, you don't know which of these other parts and pieces are applicable to your project. And you've already gone through chapter 3. Remember, that applies to every project. So it's just kind of a layering thing that's going on here. Every project triggers chapter 3 requirements. Then when you get into work area method, every project has to go through chapter 6 because that tells you what of the other chapters apply to your particular project. So the first thing that you have to understand in using the work area method is, what is work area? And again, I already showed you this definition, but that is enough to understand it. I didn't understand it from just reading that definition. And again, this is new to California, so there are people here that know this method, but there are a heck of a lot more people who don't know this method, and they look at it and they think, what the heck is this chapter all about? So here's some examples of work scopes and whether or not that work scope involves work area. And again, just bear with me for a minute. I know that statement sounds confusing. So let's just say you're repairing, you have some repairs, one suite of a building has some new finishes, you're having to do some accessibility work. That's going to trigger chapters 1 to 3. That applies to every single project, so that's a no-brainer. There's some repairs. That applies to most projects. And this scope of work is a level 1 alteration. Level 1 alterations trigger no work area. I know you're doing work on the building, but work area and work you're doing are not the same thing. Work area is a specific term unique to the California and the International Existing Building Code. It has a special meaning, and it's different than the word work. This scope of work has no work area. So you would not have a diagram on your plans for this scope of work showing an area, geographic area, part of the project. It's not needed. You could do a narrative of what's a repair and a narrative of the level 1 alterations in your typical notes, and a citation that you're using the work area method of the California Existing Building Code, and you're good to go. Here's a different scope of work. Same as the first, and you're doing a re-roof. You got new interior finishes throughout. You're replacing the piping. You have some code required fixture replacements because California is mandating it for water conservation. And that stuff triggers more accessibility work. This is still within Chapter 7, Level 1 alterations. All that stuff, no work area. Yeah, I know. You're just thinking, what? What? I know. That's just the word work area. It's a special word. Now we're going to take that same scope of work. Now you've removed some windows and resized some windows. You have a non-bearing wall removed and some structural changes that affect about 1/3 the total area. Now you have to use chapters 1 and 3, chapter 4. Chapter 7 still applies because this is cumulative. Anytime, and that's chapter 2, alteration. This stuff are chapter 2 alterations, which have a work area that is shown graphically on your construction documents. And everything in chapter 7 that's mandated still applies. You cannot be in chapter 8 and not also be using the stuff from chapter 7. It's a progression. So that's why you can't just pick up the book and read it. You got to start, first choose this method, then you got to go through the scoping of chapter 6, then you got to look at your work and how it is defined in these levels of alteration. Let's say now you have that same scope of work, but now you're affecting structural changes in 2/3 of the total area. That triggers chapter 9. That makes it level 3. A certain percentage of level 2 alterations, all of a sudden the project becomes a level 3 alteration, which has a work area, which has to be shown graphically, and you have to look and meet all the requirements of chapters 3, 4, 7, 8, and 9. So let me put this in different words. Work is different than work area. The work area considers what happens on a project via different categories. The only project activities that contribute to something called work area are level 2 alterations. That's it. How many level 2 alterations and what percentage tells you whether you are a level 3 alteration. Things that are not part of the work area that can make a project into that, that can trigger a level 3 alteration. Repairs are not an alteration. Level 1 alterations, re-roof, swapping out windows and doors. Now, if you eliminate a window, that's not a level 1 alteration. If you add a window, that's not a level 1 alteration. If you take a window out and put a window back in the same opening in the wall, that's a level 1 alteration. Changing materials is level 1 alteration. Changing fixtures or equipment, those are level 1 alterations. They don't involve any work area. When you do work that occurs throughout a job site, and you have to reference this 801.3, that's mechanical, electrical, plumbing, hardware changing. You change all the door lock sets, that is not a level 2 alteration. That is not a work area. Accessibility work is not a work area. If you make an addition and don't touch the rest of the building, that addition area is covered by Chapter 11. But the addition is not an alteration of an existing space, so it is not part of a work area. You would show on your plans where the addition is, but that is not part of the area that would trigger level alterations 2 or level alterations 3. Same thing with change of use. The area within which you change use is covered by Chapter 10. If that is all that you're doing and you're not touching the rest of the building does not have work area in it. If you are changing the rest of the building, you have to evaluate what you're doing and characterize it as level 1 or level 2. If it's more than 50% level 2, then it becomes level 3. I hope that helps explain it. I know that's the hardest thing to get your arms around in the work area method is the word work area. And maybe they're using the wrong term. Maybe the term should be changed. I don't know. But once you get it, it's like, oh, okay, now I understand. And I hope that lengthy explanation was good. I'm still on track here. So we're going to go till we got about another 20 minutes. Level 1 alterations, as I mentioned, they don't trigger work area. They can't make the building less safe unless the portion made less safe conforms to the California Building Code, regular code. Maintain the existing level of fire protection, fire alarms, and means of egress. Your increased loads from equipment changeouts can't trigger more than 5%. Your bracing and analysis of URM parapets is required when you're re-roofing more than a quarter of the roof area. And I think most design professionals want to brace those parapets anyway. But if for some reason, let's just say there's some reason, if you're just re-roofing 24% of the roof area, you are not required by the code to brace or analyze the URM parapets. When you do roof replacement or recover, you're not required to change the slope of the structure. You're not required to change the overflows. If you do change the overflows, you need to meet the basic code. Same thing if you're reconstructing flashing. And new materials typically need to meet new code. Fall prevention and emergency escape windows, there are some latitudes there that allow you to do smaller openings than normal code requires, and those are the same as in Chapter 5. Now let's talk about level 2 alterations. When you add doors or eliminate doors or windows, when you reconfigure rooms, layouts, now you're triggering level 2 alterations. Installing additional equipment. If you do this type of activity over more than 50% of the total building area, all of the work area becomes a level 3 alteration. And there are exceptions. It does not apply when your project is limited to one or more is important, of mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire, hazards abatement, windows, change out, hardware, accessibility upgrades, fixtures, racks, counters, partitions not over 5 feet 9 inches high. If your work area goes over 50% of an individual floor, up here it's talking about the total building. If it's over 50% of a floor, the standards for that floor apply to the entire floor relative to exiting, door protection, etc. So there's 2 triggers there, and that's why I put the little triangles. One is the trigger related to total building area. One is the trigger when your work area exceeds 50% of any given floor. So you have to be aware of both of those. There is a provision that's unique to the work area method that allows the use of fire retardant treatment for finishes, unless they're entirely out of the work area, in which case you don't have to upgrade them. But your finishes need to meet the CEBC, so you could keep, you have some beautiful paneling that may not meet the current code. You're allowed to there are a bunch of clear fire retardant treatments. You're allowed to use a fire retardant treatment on that. You do not need to meet current light and vent area for new windows under the CBC, which right now allows you to use alternatives for both of those anyway, but there are some code changes potentially coming and have been adopted in some jurisdictions that could make this exception important. So keep an eye on that. You all remember the big controversy of the dorm proposed in UC Santa Barbara, and projects like that have occurred. And so there's a movement nationally to change the requirements that are now in the CEBC that allow substitution of artificial light, which may affect some adaptive reuse projects. And I'm hoping that there's going to be a balanced and nuanced approach so that we don't kill the goose before it's laid its eggs. Existing egress is okay unless it's hazardous. You've got some provisions that are allowable dead ends that are a little longer than permitted by this California building code, but you do have to upgrade exit signs and egress lighting. You can use existing fire escapes and even put in new fire escapes when the property constraints require them. You can leave stairs even when they don't meet the typical code 711. But you do have to put new handrails in. You do have sometimes situations, as you know, with handrails where the extensions create hazards, and you know, that is something that you work with your local code official to find an equivalent facilitation. But changing out stairs in both sets of standards is relatively rarely going to be required because of the structural impacts of that. Structural standards are the same as the prescriptive measures. General rule, 5% gravity increases are going to be under the radar, and up to 10% lateral increases are under the radar. Now let's go to chapter 9, which is level 3 alterations. Now the work area, and remember, work area is not the area within which you're working. It is this term, work area, so it really should be in italics here. It exceeds 50% of the building area. Now you have to take the stair enclosures all the way to the exit, which makes sense. You know, you get into a protected enclosure, you want to be in that enclosure all the way until you get out of the building. That is not a requirement for chapter 8, level 2 alterations, by the way. Some latitude for fire separation between dwelling units, consistent with existing wall structure. That's in reference to, you know, existing lath and plaster. If you're not tearing open the floors, you have some latitude here where you can leave, like say, let's say you have a hallway in an old office building. It may serve as a fire separating element and not require you to tear open the floor. Or if you have a bunch of offices, the walls between them may be allowed to remain without opening the floor if they can serve to dive as the demising walls between your units. You know, fire sprinkler alarm per current code, as is typical throughout California. Now we get into chapter 10, change of occupancy. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there is a different set of requirements for change in occupancy classification than for change in the purpose or level of activity. And this tells you that when you change the occupancy classification, chapter 9 for level 3 alteration applies with all the provisions in addition of section 1011, and those address risk level. If you're only changing the use or the scope of the use, those allow for complying with a different subset of requirements. So this is a higher requirement than this, and they are different. So different triggers and different outcomes. You have to do fire protection and alarm system. What the code says within the area, the change of occupancy and parts of the building not separated by a firewall. There are some provisions that allow for some latitude in what type of firewall. I know firewall is a defined term. It may not be a firewall as you know it from the current code. Whether that's going to be permitted in your local jurisdiction or not, based on a rather uniform opinion on the part of fire marshals that partial sprinklers are not allowed in California. That's an open conversation and one that I'm encouraging to occur even relative to the historic code. Interior finishes have to meet the code, and it has a bunch of these tables in chapter 10. One is a table for means of egress. And if you look at the right here, you'll find that occupancies are in different different levels of use. So if you're going from an R2 or going from a B to an R2, you are going to up a level in hazard, which triggers greater requirements for egress. If you're going down, you can meet existing systems can comply with section 905. And again, this is confusing because this isn't talking here about the building and how its characteristics conform to the standards. This is talking about how the building is currently used and how what the new use is. How a building is used and how it performs may be different. I think the assumption when this table was created was buildings are built to the lowest standard allowed by code. And that isn't always the case. Sometimes they're built better. Sometimes a building changes how it's used over time and is built to one standard and it gets used by a lesser requirement. But anyway, this is something that needs to be looked at early in the process. There's a similar table for height and area classification, and that is how big can the building be, how high can it be, lower or equal hazard, existing is deemed okay. If you're increasing hazard, like if you're going from an S1 to an R2 or from a B to an R2, that's considered increasing the hazard. Then you have to look at these requirements, fully sprinklered, areas check, and separation of elements is a way to reduce requirements. It does allow you to meet a 1 hour requirement with historic assemblies, including 1/2-inch regular chipboard. There's a similar third table for exposure of exterior walls. And again, going from a B to an R here, there is no change. So what any office building can be used for R without existing is deemed okay, and protecting of openings not required. So these are new standards. And then you finally have the structural risk category that we already talked about. Most buildings are in category 2. There are some exceptions here based on site factor, seismic site factor. You can make some shifts. There are some restrictions on when you use storage or accessory occupancies or U occupancies, miscellaneous, and those are ones that, again, I'm not getting clearer understanding from ICC of where those requirements came from, and they're not covered very well in the code interpretive manual. Those are all things that are currently being looked at. But let me put this all together in one slide. Chapter 10 has these tables. So if you look at different occupancies, if what you're trying to do is R2, you can go from an A and an R2 and exiting is considered equivalent. If you can't go from S2 or B to R2 without dealing with some egress requirements. Same thing with the other. And based on where we're at, I'm not going to spend any more time on that because you're going to have to look at it. If you do additions, when you add area, logically, you must meet current code, and you have to be careful you don't create or extend non-conforming situations. You do have to check height and area. You have to consider flood hazard. Your new area has to meet current code for structure, and you have to make sure your new building doesn't put loads onto the existing building. So I took all this material and put it into some checklists because all these code issues fall into some categories. And if you're using the CEBC, whether you're using the prescriptive or the work area method, these are kind of my thumbnail summaries of what is going to be required, what the triggers are. And these are the issues. Your re-roofing. Re-roofing does not trigger minimum slope or overflow. And I cited that earlier. Passive fire protection. You have to look at risk levels. Active fire protection, it's going to be required for most projects of scale. Egress, you pretty much have to meet current code in terms of your new occupant load. The number of exits, you have some limited flexibility in the code and so forth and so on. You want to look at this in relation to your project. Maybe this is good as an early checklist, because if you're asked as an architect to look at a potential project, your challenge isn't to solve the problem in great detail right from the get-go. My gosh, you'd spend tens of thousands of dollars doing that when there are a dozen things that could be deal killers. What you have to do is you have to approach that project progressively, and you have to go logically look at the worst possible deal killers first and see if there are going to be triggers. Because if they're going to kill the deal, why look further? You know, and that leads me to this next slide. If you ask me, Mike, could an existing building project be considered new construction, which would mandate you're having to use the California Building Code? Could that be triggered by some local code change? Yes. And in fact, I found a survey done by this entity, Local Codes and Standards, that they're the people behind Energy Code ACE and have done such a great job. And they're actually picking up the banner on embodied carbon, developing tools and resources to help make that easy for architects and developers to apply and understand. They did a survey of building officials. They didn't check every building jurisdiction, all 500 in the state, but they found everybody's doing something different, unfortunately. Whole variety of definitions of how much project activity can occur before current code is triggered. There is this they found the most common thing is 50% of existing foundation or 50% of existing framing within a 3-year period. But again, every building department is different. This is a challenge, and this is something that AI California is looking at, because one of our high-level objectives, greater consistency in the code landscape. When we get greater consistency, it's better for building departments, better for communities, better for the state of California, better for design professionals. It makes it so that somebody can more quickly evaluate project opportunities. So let's look now at some examples as I go into the home stretch here of what are work areas submittal documents look like. Well, I think you have to actually say what code method you're using, that you're going to use the existing building code and what method. You should probably put a narrative on the work that you consider to be level 1 alterations and chapter 4 repairs, because that helps the plan reviewer understand how to check the plans. So I think that's good practice. You are required to identify the quote work area. And again, work area is very specifically defined, and I gave you a lot of examples. So if there is a work area, there should be a boundary and it should be clear. If that work area is less than 50% of the building area, it's going to be a level 2. If it's more than 50%, the whole project becomes a level 2 alteration. The example in the ICC from work area is this really simple example, real simple diagram, probably easy for them to create this image. But real area analyses can be far more nuanced. Let's say, for an example, here's an existing building. Here it is after alterations. Got a whole bunch of new walls in here. Those are work area. What about where you're leaving an existing wall? Some building departments say, yeah, 2 feet on each side of that wall, you can take that out. That's outside the work area. So those little areas in blue, why would you want to bother? Well, what if you're really close? Could you call this outside the work area? I'd say pretty clearly, because you got a pretty clear demising line. Is this outside the work area? Well, it's one room, part of which is being used. Clearly, this area is outside the work area. And again, you know, every design professional, your diagram could be more complicated than this, is what I'm saying. It should be realistic. You should have some logic. If you give a road path to your code official, you're doing yourself a big favor and you're making it easy for them. And I want to wrap up with some examples real projects and imagined projects of occupancy changes. Remember this drive to make it easier to do commercial to residential. It's a major mission. There was a law passed that required HCG to conduct hearing. The first launch of that effort occurred today, actually. I and dozens of other architects and code officials and people from around the state were on the call. There is a major effort to try and encourage more reuse of our obsolete, underutilized, and even abandoned commercial buildings for housing. Let's just say you have an occupancy change of an R1 hotel or motel to R2 apartment. Well, you're not changing risk category. You've got a lot of the plumbing and electrical and systems that may be able to exist. You're not changing the, so the scope of that could be pretty minor. These are real projects. You know, this is an example of a project that I worked on where I made small additions to take, for every 3 units, I created 2 living units. Here's another one that had about the same ratio. That is a motel to housing conversion. Some of the units are literally like a motel unit with a little micro kitchen. Some of them combine 2 of them. This is another example of this type of project in a building in downtown Stockton, a major downtown building, which is now a high density affordable housing project. How about when you go from assembly to R2? Well, that's actually an easy, as I mentioned, some of the stuff has to come up to current code, like fire sprinklers. Some of it is going to raise some infrastructure issues. Others, like height and area and egress, there's no change in risk category. Does this happen? Yeah, here's an example of a building, happens to be one of my projects. It was planned to have restaurant on the ground floor. It's just a couple blocks from the arena. Well, after 5 years of empty and no takers, the developer decided, I gotta put something in there. So we put residential units in there. It's under construction right now, and it has units, even live work units that face the street that are using the live work provisions, where there's a living unit and then an area that can be used for, you know, an artist to display their work, and because I had existing storefront that I couldn't change. Now, what about a change in occupancy from office or retail or warehouse to R2? Well, that's going to involve more issues. You are moving up in risk category in a number of areas. This is an example of a project that a developer talked to me about. It was built as a Bank of America in the 70s, steel frame building. This project died. Why? It's in the city of Sacramento, triggered full structural upgrade, foundations to roof, every structural connection, all the foundation loads. Guess what use it is today after it's sat empty for years and years and years? It could have been 88 new apartments or 154 hotel. It's office with no structural upgrade. Here's an F converted to an R2, an abandoned silo in Mill Complex in Sacramento, major project. Here's a warehouse. This is the part of a project that involved converting a warehouse to historic warehouse. The details of code analysis, because this building has 3 separate structures, 3 different construction types. It's a mixture of new construction, historic adaptive reuse, involved multiple AMMRs, but a beautiful project in Sacramento of artist colony that has some lovely interior spaces, and we need to see more of this work. One of the architects that I want to give real kudos to, I'm giving Karen Littledren. Karen, she always corrects me when I mispronounce her name. Sorry, Karen, if you're on. She did this great little brochure that's on her website. I just love this. It shows that every building has potential to be housing. Every building. I know there's a scoring mechanism. There's a really large architectural firm that's doing work all over the world, and they can come out and do a score. They're doing it for Calgary. One of the things that I was concerned about is buildings that don't score highly on this metric. They're providing funds to help tear these buildings down, as well as those that do score well. They're providing funds to help convert them to housing. Well, tearing those big buildings down is a huge climate negative move. It's a disaster from a climate change standpoint. And sure, they're tough. They may not have the right depth to ratio, but there are a lot of clever solutions. Here's one of a 54-foot deep unit that has shared borrowed light through multiple layers and lovely interiors. And this could be used on a lot of these buildings that score poorly. When you come to, here's a little strip mall, and actually with underground parking in downtown LA. And Karen and her team did a design study showing how these can be turned into these really cool live work units, and use the existing structure just the way it is. Same thing with a partially empty building or a building that has a use like parking on the ground floor, where you can put street facing live work units on the ground level. Taking advantage of this could be done literally anywhere in California based on my read of the current provisions for live work in the CEBC. The provisions in LA are even more aggressive and liberal than those in the regular code. And another example of how you can take a really big footprint, an old Kmart or some big box kind of a thing, and cut holes out in the center in order to bring in natural light and still create viable units. So this is an issue being talked about all over the country. There are all these studies being done. The White House is working on this. There are communities, like I mentioned, Calgary, the governor Newsom is taking vacant state buildings and already working on converting them. As I mentioned, Calgary has a very aggressive policy. I think maybe a little off the track in terms of the subsidizing of building demolition, which is premature when we're still evolving the tools and techniques to do these kind of projects. It's a moving landscape. As I said, there was a meeting today of a working group that's looking at California codes to try and encourage this type of work and support it. There's a national ICC working group that I'm on that's looking at these kinds of projects. And that's my final slide. And I apologize, I haven't been watching the chat at all. I've been totally focused. And we've got a few minutes left for those of you who aren't totally exhausted at this point with a nonstop, just a barrage of words and images and oh my gosh. So I'm going to look and see. I see there are some things in Q&A, so we'll take a few minutes here. So Ophelia asks about Fire Code Chapter 11 and the means of egress for existing building codes. I did talk about that a little bit. The Chapter 11 requirements, when you look at them, they only apply to certain types of buildings, R1, R2 existing buildings, very high occupancy assembly buildings, and high-rise buildings. I know that all these issues are being worked on right now. There are independent efforts going on in the city of Los Angeles, in the city of San Francisco. San Diego has made some code changes and has others underway. There are people all over California concerned about what's talked about as a tsunami of foreclosed office buildings that we're seeing coming. We need to get those buildings not torn down, but in use as housing. It's right where we need the housing, right in our urban cores. It'll keep alive the retailers that have survived, the restaurants. It's good jobs. It's good for climate action. It's like, oh my gosh, we need to make these projects happen. So I'm going back to the questions here. I still have a couple of minutes. I'll probably take this right down to the finish line. And again, those of you exhausted, feel free to jump off. I hope that a few of you have made it with me. I don't get to see how many of, oh, I see. Yeah, gosh, we got a big group still with us. I show 169 people still with us, 2 hours nonstop through the lunch hour. Oh my gosh. Pat yourself on the back, every one of you. That's just amazing. So is there any information available concerning how the insurance industry will address insurability on code provisions? Well, it is California code, so it's part of the law. I don't really know the answer to that, but maybe someone does. If you configure a 4 for less than 50% of the area, it remains level 2. Well, it's less than 50% of the area of the building. it remains level 2. If it's 50% of the level of the floor, it is level 2, but it does change. If you change from R2 to R1, that is an occupancy change, so Chapter 10 would apply. You're not going to be moving a lot of walls in those well, if it's R2 to R1, yeah, those projects would involve a lot of walls. So those are going to be challenging. But R1 to R2, like a hotel or a motel to a multifamily, those are easier projects, actually, in my experience, and I've done several of those. Is R2 to R1 a change of use? Yes, it's a different classification. It's still R, and you'll see in some of those tables, R is all grouped together. In other tables, R1 and R2 are separated out, and they actually even fall on different lines. DSA has limited adoption to only sections of the existing building code. You know, I've talked to DSA about that. They are working on trying, because they recognize the climate change benefits. They were huge supporters of the embodied carbon measures, which by itself are incentivizing the saving of existing buildings. And it saves money often when you save an existing building too, if you connect with the right design professionals. Some design professionals just aren't really wired to work on existing buildings, but those that are, the ones that I know, man, they'll tackle any project. They see it as a unique challenge, you know, and it's actually exciting. It's just as exciting as creating some amorphous new shape or something novel form. So I do believe that DSA is working on this, but in terms of an actual adoption, I don't know. And the question, can you use CEBC on OSHPD projects? No, you cannot. OSHPD does adopt portions of the CEBC. They create their own chapters. So you talk about adding complexity to the code. The OSHPD adoptions are entire version different from the chapter. So there's a chapter 3 OSHPD and there's a chapter 3 for the rest of the projects, and they have not adopted the work area for any type of project. California, its own code, yeah, the more there are local modifications, the harder it is for the citizens of California to afford projects, the harder it is for architects to create efficient design, the harder it is to understand for a developer what they're getting into when they look at an opportunity. So why is live work only allowed on the ground floor? That's probably an accessibility question. I think Rick Abrams was a big mover in those code changes that occurred. And he's, for those of you in West Hollywood, he's now a member of the city staff in West Hollywood and probably could answer that question better than me. But anyway, live work in Los Angeles has a whole different set of opportunities. So look at chapter 85 of the municipal code and you're going to go, oh my gosh, it's like a whole separate code here. When replacing a roof, energy code is got different requirements than the existing building code, and the energy code requirements apply even if existing building code says you don't have to do something. You could insulate from underneath, but if you're going to put insulation on the deck and you change the slope, you would have to change it to meet current code. And changing it would mean, in my opinion, if I were a code official, lifting the drainage surface is a change in slope. So then you would trigger, you know, that's the same as remodeling the roof pitch. Is it better to adopt the historic code than the CEBC? Yeah, absolutely, especially for residential. My experience in working with the historic code is it is by far the most powerful tool. The appeal process is a hidden secret that if every architect in California knew about that code's ability to get an answer to a question and to challenge an interpretation that they feel is not correct, oh my gosh, that's unique. You know, we're talking about trying to bring that opportunity at a state level to other codes too. I believe there should be a mechanism like that available for California building code. It would create greater uniformity if we had a repository of code opinions and we had a code body that could render opinions. That would create greater uniformity and get us back on track to be a state where uniformly we support housing, because that is not the case right now. There are places that use the code as a tool to prevent housing from occurring. And I'm not saying that's prevalent, and it's less prevalent than it used to be, but I do believe that still may be occurring. And the way our codes are written in the local adoption process is any code official can adopt a measure that's more restrictive, even if that measure kills the opportunity to create housing in an urban core that's dying because it's got a bunch of empty storefronts, it has empty office buildings. Who wants an old office building? Who wants to be in an old office building with the old-fashioned corridor down the middle with no natural light and all these little cut-up little rooms to the left and the right? Nobody wants to work in a building like that anymore, but those buildings actually lend themselves very well to housing conversions. I mean, you do have to make those corridors pleasant spaces, but anyway, just about out of time. What is the firm that assesses for adaptive reuse? I don't know what that question means, but if you're asking where can you get an opinion, if you're using the historic opinion code, the Office of the State Architect manages that code, and they manage email, they respond to emails and phone calls, and are prepared to give an appeal, give legal opinions. Do you have any opinion on legal responsibility of the architect if an existing building alteration would subsequently experience damage? Well, every building's subject to damage. So I think the architect has a standard of care that applies to our profession. I'm an architect, I'm licensed. The standard of care is not based even on meeting code. Standard of care is to do what another prudent architect would do in the same location under the same circumstances. That's a pretty fuzzy line, but that's the line we all have to toe to, meet or exceed that standard. And that is the foundation of what we're required as professionals to look out for the public health, safety, and welfare. That does not mean to protect people absolutely from bad things happening. You know that even a building built to current code is at risk of bad things happening. People get hurt in buildings built to code that have no deficiencies in them at all from a code standpoint. And that's inevitable. It's a moving target. It's not like a light switch, safe, unsafe. It's a dimmer. And the more you spend, the greater the safety you can provide. And there's a new method of evaluating life safety actually that's emerged in Sweden, where they have a national standard that said a human life is immeasurable. And because of that, they can't use the normal how many people are going to die and what's the value of human life and how likely is this event to happen. That's the sort of metric that's mostly used in the United States to evaluate risk. That method can't be used in Switzerland. If I said Sweden, I meant Switzerland. So they've come up with a whole different metric, and it's just brilliant. It's based on willingness to pay on the part of the public. And they create these charts, and it's what we should be doing, honestly, in my humble opinion. And that is, I hope, the direction we move as a way to evaluate risk, because it's just like, think about insulation. Would R1000 insulation reduce energy consumption? Yeah, R100 reduces energy consumption. At some point, you got to draw a line, though, because elements get too thick, it costs too much money, it becomes just a box of insulation. It's not usable anymore for human habitation. So we do that in all codes. You draw a line somewhere, and that's the standard. And that's, and again, the more flexibility we have, the greater the creative power of architects to shape environments that will serve us going forward out of our existing buildings. That's what we have to work with. That's the majority of the buildings. They're already out there. We need to be looking at every one of those buildings. We as architects should be out there finding the opportunities, going to the developer saying, I found this great opportunity for you. Look at what you can create here for our community, or do it yourself, develop projects yourself. So anyway, we're out of time. I appreciate your willingness. I'm sorry I didn't give any an opportunity to speak. Maybe with 100 people online, it wouldn't have worked anyway, but great fun to do this. There is going to be an in-person presentation of the same topic in Long Beach in October. If you're interested, let AIA know. It's in conjunction with the same time the ICC meeting. If you're down there for that, it's we're noon hour again, but it's in person, and these are a lot of fun to do in person. And I will stay as long as people want to stay and talk about it, because this is, I think, what we need to be talking about as architects. This is what AIA California has been pushing on And I'm 100% behind this. So anyway, welcome. I release you. If you didn't eat your lunch, grab it now before you have to jump back to work. So with that, I'll stop sharing and turn it back to Sarah to close the show.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for a super important and informative presentation. We've got a lot of really great feedback already. So thank you all to the attendees for providing or joining us for so much of your valuable time today to hear Mike and a little bit more about the existing building code and beyond. If you've made it this far, AIA California will submit you for AIA course credit. There will be a follow-up email where folks can also request a certificate for today's program. And of course, you can always respond to that email with any additional questions. And we'll be taking a look at the Q&A for any questions that were left over from today. Thank you guys all again so much, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.